Hello guys, today I'm going to show you how to implement a one-to-one, one-to-many, and many-to-many database mapping into a RESTful API uni and bidirectionally. This is a database that we will implement in our application. We have a city, a zip code, an author, a book, a category entity. We will write their mappings using string annotations. The city and the zip code entities will have a one-to-one relationship. This means that city can only have one zip code and zip code can only have one city. This relationship is a unidirectional relationship, and this means that zip code has a reference to the city entity, but city does not have a reference to the zip code entity. The author and zip code entities will have a one-to-many relationship. This means that author can only have one zip code, a zip code can have multiple authors. This relationship is also a unidirectional relationship. This means that author entity has a reference to zip code entity, but zip code does not have a reference to the author entity. The author and book entities will have a many-to-many relationship. This means that author can have multiple books and books can have multiple authors. This relationship is a bidirectional relationship. This means that book entity has a reference to the author entity and the author entity has a reference to the book entity. The book and category entities will have a many-to-one relationship. This means that a category will have multiple books, but book can only have one category. This relationship is also a bidirectional relationship, and this means that category entity will have a reference to the books, and books entity will have a reference to the category entity. We map our relationship with JPA annotations. Those annotations start with an @ symbol and then their types, and we place those annotations on top of our fields. The join column annotation indicates that this entity is the owner of the relationship, and the map by attribute indicates that this entity is the inverse of the relationship and that the owner resides in the author. Go to Spring Initializer, select the project Maven, language Java, and the version 2.6.3. Select the group name, data JPA, and the artifact name, relationship. We also need dependencies. We need the Lombok dependency, Spring Web dependency, the Spring Data JPA dependency, and the H2 dependency. Click up Generate. Open your project in IntelliJ and we'll start with writing our entities. Create a package named model. In this package, we will create our 5 entities. The first entity is the city entity. The second one is the zip code entity. The third one is the author entity. The fourth one is the book entity. And the last one is the category entity. Open your city entity and we will start with writing our annotations. The first annotation is the entity annotation. Oops. The second one is the data annotation. And this is a Lombok annotation, and this will provide us with the getters and setters. The next one is the noArgs constructor. And this is also a Lombok annotation. And the last one is the table annotation. And this will give our entity a name in our database. And we will name it city. Now copy those annotations and we will place them on top of our other entities. And change the name to zip codes. Copy it in category. Oops. Paste it also in the book entity. And also in the author entity. Once again, open your city entity. I will start with writing our fields. The first field is the ID field with type long. Second one is the name field with the type of string. On top of our ID field, we need two annotations. The first annotation is the ID annotation, and the second one is the generated value annotation. And this will tell Hibernate how to create this ID in the database with strategy auto. You also need a constructor for a name. And our city entity is done. Now let's go to the zip code entity. The first field is the ID field with type long. The second one is the name field with the type string. And the third one is the city field with the type city. And we need this field for our mapping. On top of our ID field, we need two annotations, the ID field, the ID annotation and the generated value annotation. On top of our city field, we need two annotations. The first one is the type of mapping, OneToOne, with cascade type all. Our second annotation will be the join column annotation. And this will create an additional column in our entity to store our city ID. Name city. We also need a constructor for the zip code entity with field with string and city. And this entity is done. Now let's go to the author entity. Our first field is the ID field with type long. The second field is the name field with the type string. Our third field is the zip code field, and we will need this field for our mapping. And our last field is the books field, and we will also need this for our mapping. And this will be a list, so we can add multiple books to the author entity. New array lists. Let's create a constructor. Now, on top of our ID field, we need two annotations. The first one is the ID annotation, and the second one is the generated value annotation. On top of our zip code field, we need two annotations. The first one is the ManyToMany annotation with cascading type all and fetch lazy. We also need to join column annotation. And we need to name this column with the ID of the zip code. On top of our book field, we need one annotation, and this is the ManyToMany annotation. We need to define how it's mapped, because this will be the inverse of our mapping, mapped by categories. Our cascade type will be all. And our fetch type will be lazy. We also need to be able to add books and remove books from this entity. So let's create that. Public void add book and type book. Books add book. We also need to be able to remove books. Public void remove book. Book. Books. Now our author entity is done. Let's go to the book entity. Our first field will be the private long ID. Second one will be our name field, and this will be of type string. Our third field will be the author field, and this will be a list, because we can have multiple authors in a book. And import the list package. And our last field will be the category field. Now, on top of our ID field, we need two annotations. And the second one will be the generate value with strategy auto. On top of our author field, we need two annotations. The first one is the ManyToMany annotation with cascade type all and fetch type lazy. Our second annotation will be the join table annotation, and this will create a new table. First, we need to define the name of the table. This will be book underscore author. Now we need to define the two columns. Join column. We'll add join columns. With name. Book ID. And the inverse of join column. With name. On top of our category field, we need two annotations. The first one will be the ManyToOne with cascade type all and fetch type lazy. Second annotation will be the join column annotation. And this will create an additional column with name, category, ID. For this entity, we will need a constructor. with the fields name, author, and category. And we also need to be able to add and delete authors as public void add author. Author. We also need to be able to delete authors. Like void delete author. Remove author. And now our books entity is also done. Let's write our last entity. Our category entity will have 3 fields. The first field will be the ID field with the type long. The second one will be our name field with the type of string. And the last one will be the book field with the type of book. And this will be a list because a category can have multiple books. And let's initialize this list. New. On top of our ID field, we need 2 annotations. The first one will be the ID annotation. The second one will be our generated value annotation with strategy auto. On top of our books field, we need a OneToMany mapping annotation that will be mapped by category with cascade type all and fetch type lazy. We also need a constructor. And now our entities are done. Let's create our data transfer objects. DTOs help us with transferring data between different layers in our application. Start with creating a DTO package. And in this package, we will create another package called, another package called request DTO. In this package, we will create our first DTO called city request DTO. Annotate this DTO with data annotation. This will provide us with the getters and setters. We only need 1 field, and this is the name field. Our second DTO is the zip code DTO. Annotate this with data. We need 2 fields, private string name and private long city ID. Our third DTO is the author DTO, author request DTO. This will have 3 fields, private string name, the private long zip code ID, and that's it. Annotate this DTO with data annotation. Our fourth one is the book DTO. Book request DTO. Annotate this with data. First field is a private string name. Second one is the private list with type long. Author. Author's ID. And the third one is the private long category ID. And our last DTO is the category DTO. Request DTO. Also annotate this with data. And this will have only the name field. Now let's write our response DTOs. Create a package called response DTO. Our first DTO will be the author response DTO. Annotate this class with data. The first field will be the ID with type long. The second one will be the name, type string. The third one will be a list of the book names. So private list string book names. Second one will be, the last one will be the zip code name. Our second response DTO is a book response DTO. Annotate this class with data. The first field will be the ID. Second one will be the name of the book with type string. The third one will be a list of the authors. And this will be of type string because we will only return their names. And the last one will be the category. And this will also be a string because we're only going to return the name of the category. Our last response DTO is the category response DTO. Annotate this with data for getters and setters. Our first field will be the ID. Second one will be the name with type string. And the last one will be a list of the books with the type string because we're only going to display the names of the books. Let's create mappers for our response DTOs. Create a class called mapper. In this class, we will create static methods, that return response DTOs. The first one will return a book response DTO that will call book to book response DTO. And this will get in the type of book. We need to import the book. Instantiate a book response DTO. New. Set the ID of book of our DTO. Set ID to the book get ID. And this method is generated by our data annotation. Now set the category name of our DTO. Book response DTO set category name. Then book get category get name. Create a list of names. And a list of authors. For each author, add the name to the name list. Names, add author, get name. And this will populate the names list. So we can add this to our book response DTO. Book response DTO. Set author names, names. And now we have to return the book response DTO. We also need to be able to return a list of book response DTOs. Public static list book response DTOs. Books to book response DTOs. That will get in a list of books. Initialize a list of book response DTOs. And for each book that we will get in our methods, add it to our list of the book response DTOs. We also need to convert this book using this method. So book to book response DTO, and we need to add the book. And once all the books are added to the book response DTO list, we can return the book response DTOs. Now let's create a mapper for auto response DTOs. So public static author responsitio author to author response DTO, and this will get a type of author. Initialize a book, an author response DTO, author response DTO. Set the ID of the author response DTO. Set ID by getting it from the author. Set the name of the author DTO by getting it from the parameter. Now create a list of names. Oh, we made a mistake here. This needs to be book get authors. Sorry. Now we need to create a list of books. New, no, author get books. And for each book, we need to put it in the, we need to get their names and put it in the list of names. So for each book, names at so each book we will get their names with the data Lombok generated getter, and we will put it in the list of names. And once all the books are added, we will add these names to our auto responsitio. Author responsitio set book names. We also need to set the category name. Now we can return the auto responsitio. Now we can return the auto responsitio. We also need to be able to return a list of auto responsitios. Public static list author authors to fonts DTOs, and this will get a list of authors. Initialize a list of auto responsitios. And for each authors, we will add them to the author respositives with the for each method. Add. And then we also need to map it with this method. And once this is done, we need to return it. We also need to map it for a category. Public static category responsitio category to category. And this will get in the category type. Initialize a category responsitio category category responsitio. Set the ID of the category responsitio. Set the name of the category. We also need to add a list of the names of the book. So first create a list of names with the type of string. Now create a list of the category books. And now we have to loop through these books and add their names to the list of the names for each. Now we have to set these names to the category responsitio. Category. And now return it. Now we have an error. I don't know what it is. This is just IntelliJ duplication error. It's nothing important. Now we also need to return a list of category responsitios. And this will get a list of categories. Initialize a list of category details. And you will add each category to this list. So for each. Categories, response details, add. Now we also need to map it with this method. So category response, category to category response detail, and place this category here. And once this is done, we need to return it. Return. This is also done. Our mappers are done. Now let's write our repositories. Create a package called repository. Our first repository will be the city repository, and this will be an interface. Annotate this with repository, and it will extend to CRUD repository. First type will be the city, with long. And in this CRUD repository, you have a lot of methods we will inherit, like the save, define by ID, find all, and we will all use them. Our second repository is the zip code repository. This will also be an interface. Add the repository annotation. Extend from the CRUD repository. With type zip codes and long. Third one will be the author repository. Annotate this also with repository. Extend the CRUD repository. Our next one is the book repository. Annotate this also with the repository annotation. Extend from the CRUD repository with type book and long. Import book. Our last repository is the category repository. Choose interface. Annotate this also with the repository annotation. Extend from the CRUD repository. From the category. First type is a category, the second one is the ID. For long. Let's create our service layer. Create a package called service. In this package, create your first service, named the city service, and this will be an interface. Annotate the service with the service annotation. Our first method will be the add cities method. This will return a city. And the parameter will be the city request ETO. Import the class city. Our second one will be the get cities method. And this will return a list of cities. Import a package called list. Our second one will be the get city method. And this will also return a city. And we need the ID so we can find the city that we want. The fourth one will be the delete city. We also need the ID. And the last one will be the edit city method. We need two parameters. The first one is the ID. The second one is the city request ETO. Now let's implement our service. Annotate the service implementation with the service annotation. We need to bring the city repository class interface. Make this a final. And we need to create a constructor for this field. Annotate this with auto-wires. Now that we have our repository, we can start writing our implementations. Let's start with the add city. First, create a new city. Set the name of the city. With the name of the city request ETO. And save it. So city repository save city. This method comes from the CRUD repository, and this will automatically return a city. Now let's implement our get cities method. First, create a list of cities. Now in the city repository, we need to find all the cities. So city repository, find all for each list, add. Oh, this needs to be city. And then return the cities. This will loop through all the cities that this repository can find and add it to this array list. And now we can return it. Now let's implement our get city method. Let's start with the return city repository. Find by ID. City ID. Or else throw Now, what I have done is I found one city, and if it didn't find it, it will throw an illegal argument exception with the message city with city ID. The city could not be found. Now we have to delete it. Now we have to implement the delete city method. First, get the city that we want to delete. And this is this method. Now we can use the delete method from a CRUD repository, and we need to parse a city entity in this method and return the deleted city. Now let's implement the edit city method. First, we need to get the city that we want to edit. City, edit, city to edit. Again, we will use this method here to get the city. And if it can't find it, it will throw an illegal argument exception. Now let's edit the name. We also need to get city request ETO. I think we made a mistake. Oh. And now we have to return the edited city. Now we are done. We also need to put transactional on top of this method. Now the city service is done. Now let's create our second interface. And this will be the zip code interface. Annotate this with the service annotation. We need 7 methods. The first method is the add zip codes method. This will return a zip code. And we need to send in a zip code request DTO. Second one is the getCities method. This will return a list of zip codes. Get zip codes. We need to import the list method, a list class. And third one is the getZipCode method with ID. This will return a zip code. Now we also need to implement the delete zip codes method. This will return a zip code. And we need the ID. Also an edit zip code method. And this will get the ID of the zip code. And the zip code request detail. Now we need to be able to add cities to the zip code. So public zip code add city to the zip code method. And this will have two parameters. The first one is the zip code ID. And the second one will be the city ID. And we need to be able to remove zip codes. So copy this. Remove city from zip codes. Now let's implement the zip code service. Context application implements interface. This is correct. Put the annotation, service annotation on top of the implementation class. First, we need to get the zip code repository. Private final zip code. And the private final city service. We need to create a constructor. And on top of this constructor, add autowired. First, we will implement the add zip code method. Create a zip code instance. Set the name of the zip code to the name of the zip code repository. Get name. Now we need to check whether the zip code request DTO has a city. So if zip code DTO request DTO get city is null, return zip code repository, save. zip codes. So if the zip code request detail doesn't have a city ID, we will save the zip codes. But if it has a city, then we need to add it. So first, create a city. And we need to get this city from the city service. And if this is not valid, then it will throw an illegal argument exception. And now we need to add this city to the zip code. Zip code, that city, and then return zip code repository, save zip code. We also need to put transactional. Now let's implement the get zip codes method. This will return a stream. Now what I have done is I have used the Java 8 method. This will loop through all the zip codes and split them into individual parts and collect it to a list. And we will return this list. Now create the get zip codes. Again, use the stream support. No, the zip codes repository. Find by ID. And place it the zip code ID in it. And if it can't find it, throw an exception, or else throw. Zip codes with ID. Found. So if it can't find a zip code, then it will throw this exception. Now let's delete the zip code. Create an instance of zip code. With the get zip code method. And if it can't find this zip code with this ID, then it will throw this exception. Now we have to delete this zip code. Write the zip code to repository. Delete zip code. And return the deleted zip code. Now let's implement the edit zip code method. First create an instance of zip code. And call it zip code to edit. Get the zip code with the ID. And if it can't find it, it will throw this exception. set the name of the zip code to edit, zip code request ETO, sorry, get name. Now we have to check whether zip code request ETO has a city. So if zip code ETO get city isn't null, then return zip code to edit. But if it has a city, then we need to change it. First create a city. And we need to get the city. So city service, get city, zip code, request ETO, get city ID. And now we have to set this city to this zip code. So zip code to edit, set city. And now we have to return the edited zip code. We need to put transactional on top of this method. Now let's implement the add city to zip code method. First, we need to get the city, the zip code, create an instance of the zip code. We also need to get the city to add. City service, get city. Now we have to check whether zip code already has a city. So if objects non-null, zip code get city. Then we need to throw an exception. Zip codes city. Now, if zip code already has a city, then it will throw this zip illegal argument exception. But if it hasn't, then we need to add it. Zip code set city. And now we need to return the zip code. We also need to put transaction on top of these methods. Now we need to remove the city. First, create an instance of zip code. Now get the city and put it in a variable. City service, get city. Now we have to do the reverse of this. So if it doesn't have a city, then this will throw an error. So if the zip code does not have a city, you cannot remove it. So we need to throw an exception. Now we need to set the zip code, the city of the zip code to null. We need to return the zip code. Actually, we don't need this city. We can also delete this. Sorry for my mistake. Because we're going to set the city of zip code to null and we don't need the city entity to delete it. Now we are done with the zip code. We also need to put a transaction on top of this method. And now we are done with this service. Now let's create the author service. Create an interface called author service. Annotate this with service. We need 8 methods. The first method is the public add author, and this will return an auto responsitio. Add author. And this will get in the author auto requestitio. Our second one will be the get author method, and this will return a list of auto responsitios. And import the list class. Our third one will be the get author by ID. And we need this 2 times. And I will explain later. Author responsitio get authors. Copy this. And we also need to return an author. And import author. And change the header of the first one to ID. We will need this method inside of our service layer, and we will use this method in our controller layer. Our next one will be the delete author method. This will return auto responsitio. And this will get in the ID of the author that we want to delete. The next one will be the edit author. And this will return an auto responsitio. First, we need the ID of the author that we want to edit. The second one will be an auto requestitio. Now we need to be able to add zip codes to author. So public author responsitio add zip codes to author. First, we need the ID of the author. And also a zip code ID that we want to remove. We need to also be able to delete zip codes. So public author response DTO delete zip codes from author. This will only get in the ID of the author because author can only have one zip code. So we just need to set the author entity zip code to null. And now let's implement this service. So context application implement interface. Great. We need to put the service annotation on top of this class. We need to import the auto repository, private, final. We also need to get the zip code service. Create a constructor. And put auto on top of this method. Now let's implement our add author method. First, we need to create an author. I will work with setters. So author, set name, author request DTO, get name. Now we have to check whether this request DTO has a zip code ID. So if author DTO, author request DTO, get city, a zip code ID. Then throw new illegal argument exception. Author needs now we need to create the zip codes. Import the zip code class. And we need to get the zip code from the zip code service. So zip codes service get zip codes. Auto request DTO get zip code ID. And we need to add it to the author. So set zip codes. And we need to save it. So author repository save zip codes. No, author. And now return the author. Our add author method is done. Oh, we also need to put transactional. And we also need to map it. So mapper author to auto response DTO and then author. Now it's really done. Now let's go to the get author method. First create a list of authors. use stream support. Stream, auto repository, find all, splitterator, false, and collect it. So collect, collectors to list. So we're going to loop through all the authors and we will split them and then we will collect them into a list. And now we have to return it. So return mapper authors, auto response DTOs, and now we need to pass it this authors here. And this will return a list of auto response DTOs. Now let's implement the get author by ID. Mapper author to auto response DTO. Get author. Now let's implement this method so we can use it here. And this is the reason I made two get authors by ID methods. The first one will return a response details. The second one will just send the author. First, create an author repository, find by ID, author ID. If it can't find it, throw or else. This is a mistake. It has to be find by ID, not find all by ID. Or else. Throw. We need to make a function. New illegal argument exception. Author with ID. Could not be found. And now we have to return this author. Now let's implement a delete author method. First create an author. We need to find the author using this method, get author. And if it can't find it, it will send this exception. Auto repository. And return the deleted author. Oh, we also need to map it. So mapper. Let's implement the edit author method. First put transaction on top of it. Now first create an author entity. Author to edit. And get the author using this method. Now we need to use setters to edit this author to edit, set name, author request DTO, get name. Now let's check whether the auto request DTO has a zip code. So if auto request DTO gets zip code ID isn't null, then make a zip code entity. Get the zip codes with the get zip code method, and put the author request DTO get zip code ID method in it. Now author to edit, set zip codes. And once we are done, we can return it. So return mapper author to auto response DTO, author to edit, and we are done. So if it doesn't have a zip code ID, then it will just jump over it and send it. Now let's implement the add zip code to author method. First, create an author. So author, get author ID. Get also the zip code. Put it in a variable. Zip code service, get zip codes. Now we have to check whether author already has a zip code, because this author can only have one zip code. So if object non-null author get zip code, close this. So if author has a zip code, then we need to throw an exception. Throw new runtime exception. Author already has a zip code. But if the zip code field of author is empty, then we need to add the zip code to author. So author set zip code to zip code, and then we need to return it. So return author, but we also need to map it. So mapper author to auto response DTO author. We need to put transactional on top of this method. So transactional. And the last method is a delete zip code from author DTO, from author. So first we need to get the author, create a variable called author. Now set the zip code field of author to null. To null. And return the new author. But you also need to map it. So mapper author response DTO author. And this also needs to be in transactional. Now let's create the book service. So we an interface. Annotate this service with service annotation. Our first method will be the add books method. Public And this will return a book response DTO. And the parameter will be the book request DTO. The second one will be the add get book method. We will write two variations of it. The first one will return a book response DTO. Get book by ID. The parameter is the book ID. You also need the second one, public book get book with long book ID, and import the book class. This one, we will use this one in our application and this one for our controller. We also need to be able to add and delete books. So public book response DTO. And we need to get the long book ID so we can find it. Our next one will be the edit book response DTO. Book. First we need to get the ID. I also need to get a book request DTO. Now we need to be able to add and remove authors from book. So public add public book response DTO, add author to book. The first parameter will be the book ID. The second one will be the author ID. We need to also be able to delete an author from book. So public book response DTO, delete author from book. I need to get in the long book ID and also the author ID. So long author ID. We also need to be able to add and remove categories from book. So public book response DTO, add category to book. So long ID, book ID, and also category ID. We also need to be able to remove categories from book. So remove, public book response DTO, add, remove category from book. First, we will get in the book ID. We also need the category ID. Now let's write the implementation. Show context action, implement interface. Annotate as a service. We need the book repository, so private final book repository. We also need the author service, the private final author service. We also need the category service, but it does not exist yet, so you need to write it also. Create this method, show context action, create interface in this package, populate it with the service annotation. I will add one, for now, one method. This will be the public category get category long category ID. I need to make a constructor and put auto-word on top of its constructor. Now let's start with implementing the add book method. First, create a book. Book. Now we're going to use setters to populate the book variable. Set name will be the first one. Book request detail. Get name. Now you need to look whether book request detail has authors, and if it doesn't have an author, then we're going to throw an exception because a book has at least one author. If book request detail get author ID is empty, throw new legal argument exception, and the text will be you need at least one author. Else, so if it doesn't have if it has an author ID of a list of author IDs, because a book can have multiple authors, then we need to add it. So first create a list of authors. Import the class author. And also import the list class. Now we need to loop through the book request detail. So for each method will work long author ID book request detail get author IDs. Create an author. And we need to find an author with the author service get author. And we need to add those authors to the author field here. and then return. So set the book authors, set the authors of the book with the set method. So what we have done is we created an array list of authors. Then we looped through the IDs of the book request DTO. I found them with the author service method, get author. And then we added these authors into the author list. And once this for each loop is done, it will set the authors of book to authors of this list. Now we have to look whether the category ID is empty. If book request DTO get author get category ID is null, then throw new illegal argument exception. Book needs at least one category. We need to create a category. So category service get category book request TTO get category ID. And now we need to set this category to the book field. So book set category. Now we could need to create another book variable, book1. And we need to save the book. The book, we need to save the book to the book repository. So save book. And we need to map it. So return mapper book repository book1. Now this is done. Now let's implement the get book by ID. First create a book and use this method to find the book. So book ID and return it. So return mapper book to book repository book. And the get book method that will returns a book entity. We need to create a book. And we need to find by ID. So book response book response and book repository find by ID. Book ID. And if it can't find it, so or else throw. New legal argument exception cannot find book with ID. Book ID. This will define cannot find book with ID, book ID. Now let's implement the delete book method. First get the book, so create a variable, get book. Book repository delete book, and now we have to return the book. But we also need to map it, so mapper, book to book repository. Now we're done. Oh, we forgot a method in the book service. And also we need to return this book, so return book. Right. We forgot to get all books method. Public list book response details get books and import it. We also need to implement this, so implement methods get book, and voila. Now let's implement this method. First, collect it in a list of books. Use stream support. Stream book repository. Find all. Split it. Split the results. And do not allow parallel. So false. And collect it to a list. So collectors to list. Now return it. Use mapper. Books to book response details and books. And this will map the list of books to a list of book response details. Now let's implement the edit book method. We also need to put transactional on top of the add book method. So I forgot it, so sorry. Edit book method is first we need to get the book that we want to edit. So book to edit and get book by book ID. First, we are going to set the edit the book name. So book to edit, set name, book, request ETO, get name. Now we're going to look whether the author list is empty. So if book ETO, request ETO, get author ID is empty. If it not empty because we use the exclamation mark, then we need to get all the authors here and put it in the book to edit book. So first create a list of authors. Now loop through all the IDs. So for each long author ID. For each author, we need to create an author. So author service, get author with author ID, and add this author to the authors list. So authors list, add author. And after we are done, we need to set the list of authors to the book to edit field. Now we have to check whether the category ID is 0. So if book request ETO get category ID is not null, then we need to create a category. Category service get category with book request ETO get name get category ID. And we need to set it to book edit field book set category. And now we have to return it. So mapper book to book response ETO book to edit. And we also need to put transaction on top of this method. So transactional. Now let's add author to book. First get the book, so book. Get book by book ID. We also need to get the author, so author. And now we have to check whether this book already has its author. So if author gets books contains author, then throw an illegal argument exception. This author is already assigned to this book. Now we have to set the author to the book and the book to the author. So book set author. Book add author, sorry. I also need to add a book to the author, so I need to return the book, so mapper book to book repository book. We need to do this because it's in a bidirectional relationship, so we need to add both. We need to add the author both to the book, and we need to add the book to the author. So this is needed. Now we need to delete the author from the book. So first, we need to get the book ID from the book. So book, get books with book ID. We also need to get the author, so author service, get author with author ID. Now we have to do the opposite of here. So if exclamation mark parentheses author get books contains author nu. If books contains book, sorry. So if author does not have book, we will throw an exception called new, throw new. Author and book does not have this author. But if it does contain the book, so we need to delete it. So author, remove book, book, and book, remove author. Maybe delete. Yeah, sorry. And we need to return the book, so return mapper. Now we need to create a add category to book method. So first get the book. So book. Now get the category. And if this category already exists in the book, then we need to do an exception. So if object non-null book get category. So if book already has a category, then it needs to throw an error because book can only have one category. So throw new. Book already has a category. But if the book is empty, if book does not have a category, then we need to add it. So book set category, category, and category add book. And we need to return it. So mapper book to book responsitio book. And I see that we forgot to implement this method in the category class. So let's implement add book and remove book. Books, remove book. Yeah. Add book. So book. And we also need to be able to remove book. So public void remove book. Oh, this works. Let's implement our last method. First, we need to get the book and the category, so we need to copy it. And we also need to check whether category is a book is empty. So put this in parentheses and put an exclamation mark. And book does not have a category to delete. And we need to set category of book to null. And we need to remove the book from the category. So category, remove book, book. And we need to return the book. So return mapper, book to book response DTO, put book in it. Now we are done. We have an error and I don't know where, so let's look at it. Oh, we forgot this. Now it's done. Now let's create our category service. This will be an interface. Oh no, we already have a category service, sorry. So go to the category service that we have created. And let's create more methods. Public, category, response DTO, add category. And this will get a category request DTO. Let's also implement a get category method that will return a category response DTO. Get category by ID with parameter category ID. Let's also write a method that will get all the categories. Public list category response DTO get categories. And import the class list. In the Java util package. We also need to be able to delete categories. Public category response DTO delete category. And we need to pass through the ID. We also need to be able to edit categories, and this will be our last method. Edit category. And we will need the ID of the category that we want to edit. And also a category request DTO. Now let's implement this interface. Show context action, implement interface. So we need to put an annotation on top of this class, so service. We also need the book And the category repository, so private, final, category repository. Create a constructor. I put AutoWire on top of it. Let's implement the get category method. So category serve repository, find by ID, category ID. If it can't find it, or else throw. Parentheses, new, illegal argument exception, could not find category with ID. That enters it. Now let's implement the add category methods. First, create category. Use setters, so category, set name, category, request ETO, get name. Then save it, so category, repository, save, category. Then return category, so mapper, category to category response ETO, category. Now let's implement the get category by ID. First, create category. And use the get method, so get category by, and then category ID. And return a category response ETO by converting it, so category to category response ETO with category. And now this is also done. Now let's implement get categories. Create a list of categories. And create a stream report. Stream category repository find all. Split iterator, so split each instance and disable parallel execution. And collect it to a list. Collect. Now convert it. So return mapper categories to categories response DTOs. Categories. Oh, this is also done. We also need to delete category. So first create a category. Get category ID. Category repository. Delete category. And return a category response ETO, so mapper, category to category response ETO, category. And now we have to edit it. Edit category. First put transactional. And now we can edit it. So first create a variable category. Category to edit, and get the category. Category to edit, set name, category, request ETO, get name, and return category mapper. Return the category response ETO, so we need to convert it. So category to category response ETO, and put the category to edit variable in it. And now we are done with the service layer. Let's start with the controller layer. Let's create a controller layer. Create a package called controller. The first controller that we are going to build is the city controller. This needs two annotations. The first is the request mapping, and also the request REST controller. And give it the URL of city. We need to bring in the city service, private final city service, and create a constructor. Add the auto-write annotation on top of it. Our first REST endpoint will be the add city method. This will be a post mapping. Add public response body, a response entity, and city. So our method will return a HTTP response of city. We need to import city. And this will get in the request body the city request ETO. Create a city variable. I use the city service to add the city request ETO. I return a new response entity with city and HTTP. Okay. Our second endpoint will be the get by ID. So get mapping with an ID as an URL parameter. This will return a city entity. Create a city variable. I use the city service to get one city. I return a new response entity. With HTTP status OK. Now let's write an endpoint for a get cities method. And this will have a get mapping public response entity, and this will return a list of cities. Create a list of cities. I use a city service to get all cities. I return a new response entity. We also need to import the list class. Now let's write the endpoint for a delete city. So it will be a delete mapping with delete ID. Public response entity city delete city. This will get in the path variable of final long ID. Create a city variable and use city service to delete the city. I return a new response entity. Now let's write our last endpoint. This is for our edit method. And this will be a post method. Post mapping with edit ID. Return a response entity of city. And this will get a request body of city request TTO and a path variable of long ID. Create a city variable. I use a city service to edit the city. First, we need to put the ID and then the city request TTO. Now we need to return a new response entity. We can copy this and paste it here. Our city controller is done. Now let's write our zip code controller. Create a new class called zip code controller. Put annotation rest controller and a request mapping. With the URL zip code. Import the zip code service, private, final. And create a constructor for it. and add auto-word on top of the constructor. The first controller the first endpoint that we will write is the add zip code method. This will be a post mapping with add as path URL public response entity with type zip code. Add zip codes. And this will get in the request body zip code request detail. And we need to import the zip code. Create a variable named zip code. I use the zip code service to add the city and to add the zip code. I return a new response entity with zip code and HTTP status awk. Second endpoint will be the get by ID. This will be a get mapping. Public response entity that returns zip codes. Get city. And this will get in the path variable an ID of type long. Create a zip code variable. I use the zip code service to get a zip code. And return a new response entity. We can copy this and paste it here. Our next endpoint will be the get all cities. So again, be a get mapping. And this will return a list of response zip code entities. Create a list of zip codes. Zip code service, get zip codes, and return a new response entity of zip codes and HTTP status awk. Our next endpoint will be the delete city and zip codes. Get the delete mapping annotation with path variable ID. Public response entity that will return a zip code. So path variable, final long ID. Create a city, a zip code variable. Use a zip code service to delete a zip code. And return a new response entity. Our next endpoint will be the edit zip code. Oh, I've been writing city, but it has to be a zip code. Sorry. Our next endpoint will be the edit zip code. So this has to be post mapping with edit and ID. As you return a response entity of zip code. This will get a request body of type zip code request ETO and a path variable of ID type long. Create a variable named zip code. Use a zip code service to edit the zip codes. First parse the ID and then the zip code request ETO. And return a new response entity. We can copy this one and place it here. Our next endpoint will be the add city endpoint. So post mapping. Add city. With city ID. To zip code. And then the zip code ID. This will return a zip code response entity. Add city. First one will path variable. Final long city ID. And a path variable of zip code ID of type long. Create a zip code variable. Use a zip code service. Add city to zip codes. The first one will be the zip code ID and the second one will be the city ID. And return this response entity. And now let's write the delete city mapping. delete city, and this will get the path variable of the zip code ID. It will return the response entity of zip code. With path variable final long zip code ID. Create a variable called zip codes. We will use the zip code service to delete the city. Add the response entity. Now let's write our author controller. We will need two annotations. The first one will be the REST controller, and the second one will be the request mapping of URL author. We need to bring in the author service, private final author service, and this needs a constructor, and add auto-write on top of it. Our first endpoint will be the add author endpoint. This will be a post mapping. Add author. Public response entity. And this will return author response DTO. Author response DTO. Add author. And we'll have a request body of auto request DTO. Create the author variable. Now create the author response variable. And use the author service to add an author. And return a new response body. With HTTP status OK. Now let's write the endpoint for the author get by ID. This will be a get mapping with get ID, public response entity that returns an auto request body, and auto response DTO, get author with path variable of type long ID. Create a auto response DTO variable I use the author service to get an author. I copy this one and place it here because it's the same. Now let's write an endpoint for our get all authors. Oops. Get mapping. Get all. This needs also backlash. Public response entity. A list of author response DTOs. And we need to import the list. Get authors. This won't have a variables, so list author response DTOs. I use the author service to get all authors. And return a list of auto response DTOs. Now let's write an endpoint for our delete author method. With parameter ID. Public response entity. The type of auto response DTO. Delete author. With path variable. Final long ID. Create an auto response DTO variable. Use the author service to delete an author and put the ID in it. And paste the response entity. Now let's write an endpoint for our edit author method. This will be a post mapping. Edit with ID. It will return a response entity of auto response DTO. Edit author with path variable. Final long ID. Create an auto response DTO variable. I use the author service to edit the author. First get an ID. And we also need a request body. I forgot this one. So request body. Final author request DTO. Author request DTO. And return a new response entity. Now let's write endpoints for our add zip code method. This will be a post mapping. Add zip codes with ID. zip code ID, two, author ID. This will return a response entity of author response DTO, response entity, author response DTO, add zip code. The first path variable is the final long zip code ID. Second one is the path variable final long author ID. Create an auto response DTO variable. And use author service to add a zip code. And return a new response entity. And our last one is the remove zip code endpoint. With path variable ID, private response entity that returns a auto response DTO. Path variable final long ID. Create a variable called auto response DTO. And use the auto service to delete a zip code. And return a new response body. Now let's create our book controller. It needs two annotations. The first annotation is a REST controller. And the second one is a request body. You need to bring the book service. So private final book service. And you need to create a constructor. On top of this constructor, you need to add auto wires. Our first endpoint will be for the book add book method, so post mapping. And this will return a response body of response entity of book response DTO add book. And we need to write the request body. It's final and type of book request DTO. Create a variable called book response DTO. I use the book service to add it. I return a new response entity with book response DTO and HTTP status OK. Our second one will be the get city by ID. So get mapping. This will return a response entity of book response DTO. With path variable ID of type long. Create a book response DTO variable. I use the book service to get the city. I use the book service to get books by ID. I return a new response entity. Now let's write our get all method. So it will be a get mapping with get all public response entity that will return a list of book response DTOs. Get cities. I made a mistake again. It has to be book. Get books. Create a variable with type of list book response DTOs. I use the book service to get all books. I return a new response entity. Add an S. Our next one will be the delete mapping. So delete with ID. And this will return a response entity of book response DTOs. So response of book response DTOs. Delete book with path variable of ID of type long. Create a variable book response DTO. I use the book service to delete the book. I return a response entity. Copy this one here. Our next one will be the edit book endpoint. So this will be a post mapping. With URL edit with ID. This will return a response entity of book response DTOs. We also need the request body. So request body final book request DTO book request DTO. The second one will be the path variable. Oops. Type long name ID. Create a variable named book repository and use the book service to edit the book. And return a new response entity. Our next one will be the add category and endpoints. So this will be a post mapping. Add category with category ID. To book. Book ID. And this will return a response entity of book. This will return a response entity of book repository. So response entity. Type book repository. Add category. First path variable as a category ID. So final long category ID. And second one is the book ID. So path variable final long book ID. Create a book response DTO variable. Book response DTO variable. I use the book service to add a category. Book ID and category ID. And return a new response entity. Now let's write an endpoint for removing a category. Remove category with category ID. To from book ID. And this will return a response entity of book repository. Remove category with the first path variable being the category ID. So path variable final long category ID. The second one is the book ID, so path variable final long book ID. Create a variable of book repository and use the book service to remove a category. First as the book ID and the second one is the category ID. And return a new response entity. Now our next one is the remove author. You add an author and endpoints. So a post mapping. Add author with author ID. To book ID. And this will return a response entity of book repository. So book repository add author, with the first path variable being the author ID. Final long author ID, and the second one being the book ID, so path variable, final long book ID. Create a variable book respositio. Use a book service to add an author, so book service, add author to book. The first one being the book ID and the second parameter as the author ID, and return a response entity. And the last one is the remove author from book. So again, a post mapping. Remove author with author ID. From book ID. This will return a response entity of book respositio. So public respositio, book respositio, remove author. The first parameter being the author ID, so path variable, final long author ID. Second being the book ID, so path variable, final long book ID. Create a variable book respositio. I use the book service to remove an author. First parameter is the book ID and second one is the author ID. And return new response entity. Now let's write our last controller, the category controller. Category controller. It will have two parameters. The first one is the REST controller. The second one is the request mapping. You need to import the category service, so public or private, final category service. And you need to add a constructor. And on top of the constructor, you need an auto-wired annotation. Our first endpoint will be the add category endpoint. It will be a post mapping. Add public response entity. And this will return an author respositio, a category respositio. Add category with a request body. Of final category request DTO. create a variable of category responsitio. I use the category service to add a category service to add a category. So category service, add category, add category request TTO, and return a new response body, a response entity, add category response DTO, and a HTTP status awk. And copy this line, Control C. Now let's write the get category endpoint, a get mapping, get with ID, public response entity with type category response DTO, get category, with path variable of final long ID, create a variable category response DTO, I use a category service to get a category by ID, and return a new response entity. These two are the same. Now let's write an endpoint to get all the categories. Public response entity. And this will return a list of category response details. Get categories with no parameters. Create a variable category response detail list. So list category response detail, category response details. Use a category service to get all categories. I return a new response entity and change this, add an S here. Now let's write an endpoint for our delete mapping. Delete by ID. Public response entity with type category response DTO. Delete category with path variable type final long ID. Create a variable of category response DTO. I use a category service to delete a category with ID. I return a new response entity. Now let's write our last mapping entity endpoint, the edit one. So it will be a post mapping. Edit by ID. So return a response entity of category response DTO. So response entity, category response DTO of edit category with a request body of final category request DTO and a path variable of type long, name ID. This is not readable, so I will put this below. Create a variable category respositio. Use a category service to edit the category. So edit category with ID and categories requestitio, and return a new response entity. Now our controllers are done, and we can start with testing it. We test our application, we need to do two things. Go to the POM XML file, and in the dependencies, add this dependency, the EO sprung fox. Rerun Maven install. Now it's also good to change the version of Spring, because I've seen that people had difficulties with this package and the 2.6.3 version. So let's change this to the 5.6 version. And we also need to configure the database. Go to the application properties in the resources file and copy this script. This is the port, and this is all the database settings. Now we can run our application. The first time it may take a while. We have an error. Let's look at it. I will pause the video and look what this error is and solve it. I have found the error. Go to the author model and change the categories to category, because we mapped by category, and in the book model the name is category and not categories. It would have been correct if this was categories, but because there is only one category, it would not make sense to write it as category, so category is a better option. Now our application is running. Go to the localhost 8080 Swagger UI index.html -symbol. And we have our controllers. This is the Swagger testing API, and we can test our controllers easily. First, we are going to add a city. So try out string. And the first city is Kortrijk. This is the city where I live. Execute. And the city is added with ID 1. Now let's add a zip code. The zip code of the city is 8500, and the city ID is 1. Execute. And this works also fine. Now let's add a category. Try out. And let's make this an educational category. And this works also fine. Now let's add an author. I'm going to put my own name, Ergun, and the zip code where I live is 2. The ID of the zip code is 2, and execute, and this works also. Now let's add a book. The author ID is 4, like we've seen, and the category ID is 3. And let's say that I wrote a book about spring data APA. Sorry that I'm not very original. Execute. And this also works. Now we can go to our database, type in localhost 880-h2, and make sure you have this URL and connect. Now we can go to the authors and run. We can see that we have an author named Ahmed with zip code 2, and the ID of the author is 4. We have also a book to author table. Let's run it. And we can see that the author has added to the book. And this is a Spring generated table. Let's go to the city and run it. And we can see that the city is added with the ID 1. Now I'm not going to test each and every endpoint, but you can do that on your own time. I'm going to finish the video. Thanks for watching. And if you liked the video, consider subscribing and like the video.